where is his money coming from?
Exactly.
Where is the money coming from?
And this is, I think, a way of Downing Street, the government, saying to Prince Andrew, you've got to get out of Royal Lodge now, otherwise this is what might happen next.
Parliament could strip him, if they wanted to, Parliament could strip him
exactly.
of every title. It could say that he is now Andrew Windsor and will be held accountable as such.
The situation for him is getting worse and worse. If the calculation was, we'll make this statement on Friday night, I'll say I'm renouncing my titles of, whatever of the Garter and Duke of York, and then it will all go away. Absolutely wrong. This is not going away. It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And the great tradition in Parliament is you never discuss the royal family on the floor of the House. And they didn't discuss the royal family on the floor. Yeah, completely. Completely. You don't discuss matters to do with the royal family in the House of Commons like that. So that wasn't discussed today. What was discussed today was whether the royal estate can be somehow held to account, or the Crown estate.
So why Ed Davies says the occupant, he doesn't name him.
Yeah.
So you can discuss. So the rule historically has been that you can discuss sort of constitutional matters. So the role of the monarch, succession, the cost of the monarchy, sort of public policy stuff. But any personal criticism of any member of the royal family, the Speaker will rule out of order.
If you think back to the whole kind of constitutional kind of questions that were swirling around the divorce of Charles and Diana, and what that would mean, and which
was announced in the Commons by John Major.
Yeah, it was, but that was a kind of like, but you don't debate the rights and wrongs, and so we didn't get a debate on the rights and wrongs. We just said, can the Crown estate be the subject of a select committee inquiry? Brackets, Prince Andrew's lease on Royal Lodge in Windsor, and Keir Starmer saying, yeah. So it absolutely.
Well, he didn't even say did he? He said, "I support this."
Well,
do we know what he was supporting?
Well, he was. So again, this is all deliberate obfuscation.
Yeah.
So I was speaking to someone at Number 10. Well, what Keir Starmer said was that it means that we could have a select committee looking into the affairs of Crown Estate. Well, if they're going to look into the Crown Estate and who gets a lease and what the terms of the lease are, it would be pretty weird if they didn't, mention Prince Andrew in that. Of course they're going to mention Prince Andrew. And I think this is a warning shot, again, from Parliament to the royal family, that the way things have been dealt with so far are not good enough, and that maybe there needs to be some calling to account of Prince Andrew and this kind of ridiculous arrangement he's got in this 30-room mansion in 100 acres of kind of Windsor Great Park.
Well, I mean, if they are serious about bringing Andrew before Parliament, that has not happened. There has not been a member of the royal family brought before or summoned before Parliament to account for themselves since Charles I and the trial of Charles I in the 17th century. And we know how that one ended, right? Like, it's just something in our constitutional system and in our parliamentary system has not been done. I mean, by the way, I think it's actually crazy in some ways that it's not been done. Certainly with regards to, the rules which have been exposed this week, which, are there, and it's not like kind of like they're a secret, but they're obviously coming in for a bit of scrutiny this week. They are crazy. They are crazy. Not least because, there's lots of sort of elements to it. There's two things that I would sort of point out. One is that, we talk about having a constitutional monarchy. The truth is actually in this country we've got a parliamentary monarchy, i.e. when it comes down to it, it is Parliament who chooses who is king, who is prince, all of this sort of stuff, all these titles. I know there's been a lot of talk about Prince Andrew's title this week as if he's the son of a monarch. It could never possibly be taken away. These things are ultimately made up. They're just made up, and it is Parliament which decides, ultimately, or could decide if it chose to exert its power.
But Parliament didn't kick this round off. That came from the palace on Friday night.
Yeah, for sure. But if they wanted to, they could do it. And if you want sort of proof of that in terms of Parliament's ultimate power over the monarchy, just ask Edward VIII in the abdication crisis, who was forced basically to abdicate by Parliament. Just ask James II. Ultimately, we sort of talk about these things if they're God-given. We have a parliamentary...
Edward VIII is what? What did we ever call him then? Just Edward?
Edward VIII. He became the Duke of Windsor.
So he retained a title.
He retained a title. He was conferred. He was given a title by King George VI, his younger brother.
Right? He would have been a prince at one stage, presumably.
I think he still was technically a prince, but he was.
And it was the abdication crisis, and you had the kind of the the players in the British society. So you had the Archbishop of Canterbury of the time, a guy called Cosmo Lang, and you had, the cabinet secretary, and they decided what was going to happen.
For all our listeners who just think they've wandered into country life, an episode
what a joy.
of country life.
Archbishop Cosmo, please come in.
but I think this is why. But I think this is why it is so fascinating what has happened today. Exactly for the reasons you say, Lewis. That when was the last time a member of the royal family was summoned to the Palace of Westminster like that, and what happened? And this is, I think, a way of Downing Street, the government, saying to Prince Andrew, you've got to get out of Royal Lodge now, otherwise this is what might happen next.
So just to bring listeners up to date, if they don't know how we've suddenly got to this point. Yes, exactly. The horse,
I may have made that
horse
up.
and hounds.
No, you're right.
Basically, this goes back to a story that the Sunday Times broke in the last 24 hours about the very minimal rent that Prince Andrew pays on his house, Royal Lodge, which is part of the royal estate in Windsor. And the reason he pays a peppercorn rent was because 20 years ago, he paid down a big lump sum of £8 million, I think it was, for refurbishments. And since then, he's paid what they call a peppercorn, very, very little indeed. And it has worked both ways in the sense that you can't have just anyone living on the royal estate because it would be a security risk. So they found a way of saying, if you repair the house, you can have it for a minimal rent. And I was talking to somebody who's quite close to the palace yesterday, and one of the things they said was, everyone goes on about the 30 bedrooms. It is an absolute falling apart state.
Good.
The Royal Lodge is not luxurious. It
You
is
want there
drafty.
to be rats crawling around, don't you?
I mean, it's pretty hard work to look after something. And £8 million probably doesn't go very far. 20 years on, it doesn't go very far with a 30-bedroom house. So they are not weirdly living in a state of huge luxury. I've realised this is like the world's tiniest violin, but it's just, I know, but it's just to put it in context for people trying to understand whether there is a lot of excess money around Prince Andrew. And I don't think there is. But one of the questions this goes to the heart of is, where is his money coming from?
Exactly.
Where is the money coming from? Because there are essentially three places that he could have had his money from. One is public purse. One is what they call a sort of the settlement, which is a special amount of money that goes on the sort of upkeep of the monarchy. And the other is from a personal purse. In other words, his late mother, the Queen, would have left him something. His father would have left him something. Maybe his brother is even paying for him now. We know he's not really earning his own money.
But read Andrew Lowney's book on Prince Andrew. The business dealings of Prince Andrew are arcane. And the line between what was public interest and what was personal gain was forever being blurred in the way that he would conduct his own affairs. And, kind of even some of the businesses that were charitable things that he set up at the palace. They also had a business spin-off that Andrew Incorporated was a beneficiary of.
But this is what I mean about taking it back to Parliament's lack of scrutiny over the royal family, as if it's kind of like just a bit improper or just a bit rude, or it's just not something that's done in this country. This is the net effect, right? Because people come up with these sort of bizarre kind of excuses, which is to say, well, what's Parliament got to do with the royal family's private money or private wealth? The truth is, when it comes to the royal family, they are the head of state, right? It is very difficult to delineate between where public money starts and their private wealth ends, right? These things are basically fused together, not least because the British royal family have one of the most opaque sets of financial arrangements of any monarchy, any constitutional monarchy in Europe. You compare them to the Scandinavian monarchies or the Dutch monarchies and so on. They have this sprawling set of affairs. Remember that they are exempt from things like the Freedom of Information Act. The king pays income tax, but only voluntarily through his own personal choice.
They don't pay inheritance.
They don't pay inheritance tax.
They do not pay capital gains.
And we know so little about, actually, and I think that is encapsulated in this story by two things. One, the fact that, as you say, Emily, we didn't even know the guy was paying a peppercorn rent until yesterday, right? This guy who has been at the centre of this endless set of fiascos and scandals for years now. We didn't know.
It is not a coincidence that has come out this week.
No.
As you said yesterday, I think somebody was pushing at an open door if they asked about that.
Well, exactly, but we didn't even know that. And then secondly as well, we still don't know to this day where that money, rumoured to be, £12 million of payment to Virginia Giuffre's family and her at the time and her estate came from, paid by Andrew. We still don't know. And there are all these rumours that it was paid for, or at least part of it was paid for, by the late Queen. Again, where did the Queen get that money? People will say, it's her private wealth. But she gets a lot of her private wealth from things like the Duchy of Lancaster, which ultimately, basically, is given to her by us, given to her by the state. How can you say, in some ways, that's not public money? And therefore, it is possible to say, and credible to say, that we have all, at least in some way, contributed to that payoff, which I think a lot of people would find
despicable. But I do think we get it. I mean, you're right that there is no opacity. But in a sense, we have created this fairy tale, haven't we? When you have a monarchy, there is so much that is kind of not really asked, not really explained. If you wanted to sort of get back to sort of raw socialism,
isn't it?
Well, yeah, but also, I mean, how ridiculous that people live in a castle. If you don't like a monarch, you certainly won't like a castle.
No,
you certainly won't like the Queen's golden piano. You
right.
certainly won't like a sort of pumpkin coach that drops you up and down the mall
because you can have
horses.
a monarchy. No, because you can have a monarchy and you can have all of those things. And you don't need to have all of the bloody hangers-on, the sort of endless extended family, as you don't in the Scandinavian countries or in the Netherlands. But also, you can have transparency. You can have Parliament being allowed to say whatever it likes and ask whatever questions it likes, and it not being treated as just terribly improper and terribly rude to ask those questions. I think that these things are linked.
I think we've travelled incredibly slowly with change. There was a lot of people thinking that after the death of Diana, that the relationship between government and the palace would change fundamentally. And the role that sort of the Blair government played in saying to the Queen, look, you can't just stay at Balmoral. You've got to come back to London, and the people are kind of feeling really unhappy that you're just all squirreled away in your Scottish estate and nobody is coming back to talk to the concerns of the British people. And she was brought back, and Parliament did, the
but
government
genuinely,
did that.
I think we look at that in a different light today. I mean, knowing what we know now about the vulnerability of those two young princes, young boys, I think we always got the sort of the Blair side of things, inevitably, the Campbell Blair side of things. I don't think we would never have heard the Queen's side of things. We would never have heard that actually she thought it was far more important to protect
them. Yeah.
the boys who just lost their mother and keep whatever was normalcy going on around them, whilst this whole country was losing its head. And I guess, there will never be a justification from the royals, but there is another side to that, which is maybe that did come first.
But that is the question that I think, Lewis, you're getting at, which is that there's got to be an accountability and a transparency about the royal family. And I think that this is all being played out now through Prince Andrew and the kind of huge problems that he's caused the royal family, because you're starting to see some of the absurdities of it. And we've just talked about the possibility of him going before a select committee. Can you imagine the circus that would be if Prince Andrew is there and has to give evidence and is called, because the same thing, it's possible, because there could be a pincer movement where the House Oversight Committee in the United States of America says, we also want to speak to him. We also want to speak to him about what he knew and how he can help us with this inquiry. Because don't think the Prince Andrew story is just a British obsession.
And they won't care.
They don't care.
They won't doff their caps.
They won't doff their caps. And I think that, Prince Andrew, the situation for him is getting worse and worse. If the calculation was, we'll make this statement on Friday night, I'll say I'm renouncing my titles of, whatever of the Garter and Duke of York, and then it will all go away. Absolutely wrong. This is not going away.
I think something that's been underestimated, though, is how deeply uncomfortable this is for the king. I mean, there is a world in which we have been sort of led towards thinking, the king's rubbing his hands in glee at seeing all this sort of come to fruition. And I think two things can be true. He doesn't want Prince Andrew in the Royal Lodge anymore. He doesn't want him on the Windsor estate. I was told that he'd quite doesn't really want him in Scotland, but that would be the lesser of two evils. He wants him out of the way. The king wants to get on with the stuff he's doing. He wants to be able to visit the synagogue in Manchester after the killings. He wants to be able to go to the Vatican, where he is today, and be with the Pope without this kind of hanging over him. And also, he's not... this is from people who know him well. He is not a vindictive man. He feels the sibling sort of side of things very intense. It's horrible. Yeah. He basically doesn't have a sort of vindictive bone of saying, ha, 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 you had this coming to you. He just wants the noise to stop. And so I think as soon as you call Andrew, you are, by implication, making things 100 times more complicated for a monarch who we all know has not been well.
Which is doubtless why Starmer,
Yeah.
his
And
reluctance
they get on
to
very
involved.
well. The King and Starmer
They
get on very well.
They get
Yeah.
on well, and there is a long history of prime ministers, especially Labour prime ministers, actually, sort of coming to the monarch's aid, wanting to shield him. And Harold Wilson did in the 60s, when there were loads of questions then about royal family finances, and it became like a really big public sort of policy question at the time, a lot of political pressure. He was the one who basically saved the Queen and went in to try and defend her. So I can completely understand that. I just think that, again, these things sort of all end up linking back, right? Which is that, one of the reasons they're now struggling is precisely because of that opacity, which is that, if in other countries in Europe, like Scandinavian countries, every penny piece of royal family finances is accounted for, scrutinised by their parliaments and their equivalent, the National Audit Office. That doesn't happen here, and so all of the questions start to rise more and more and more about where all this money is coming from and where the money came from.
The trouble with that, Lewis, is that I can see it going down the sort of like MPs' expenses things, where we hear about, the Chris Huhne trouser press, and it's like, well, did you need the trouser press? Well, did you need your ceiling doing?
I think it's going to be a bit more
Or
than trouser press. I mean, like...
That's what I'm saying, though, that I don't think you can marry. I mean, I totally get you. My logical kind of brain of democracy says, of course. But if you are believing in the fairy tale of monarchy, then do we really want to know how much those gold coaches cost?
Let's go.
Well, because it is. Because the whole thing is preposterous.
That's the way we do it.
As soon as you touch it, it is preposterous.
But then on that basis, you could justify any amount of opacity at all. And that is how the royal family have done it for
I think they
decades.
have.
But let's go back a step from the financial transparency, which is to talk about the abdication crisis and how that can guide us. The fact of the matter is we do not have a written constitution in this country. There are no rules. We can change the rules as we see fit and when we do it. We're very, very flexible.
Yeah, Parliament could strip him if they wanted to. Parliament could strip him
exactly
of every title. It could say that he is now Andrew Windsor and will be held accountable as such.
Exactly. When the abdication crisis happened, it was a question of what public opinion would bear, and the government decided what public opinion would bear and what was the right thing for the government to do given those circumstances. And Baldwin and, the Archbishop and whoever else, they kind of thought, right, well, we can't actually have him marrying an American divorcee and all the rest of it. He cannot remain king like this. He's got to abdicate the throne. They could decide what they want Prince Andrew to do. If they feel that public opinion is running so far and so fast against him, they could decide that.
But they just won't.
And I thought...
Because that makes a mockery of having a monarch as the head of state. Yeah, but they won't. I mean...
They did in the 1930s.
Where I think it becomes interesting is William's response to his uncle, right? I mean, I was told that he thinks his uncle is, quote, beyond hideous. So whatever Charles does or doesn't do, I think the relationship will be very, very different in the next king's reign.
But I thought it was very interesting yesterday that Robert Jenrick broke ranks and decided, apparently off his own bat, to basically criticise Andrew directly and to break some of the parliamentary kind of omerta on discussing this. And I think that does tell you something, and you're seeing it more and more among parliamentarians expressing more frustration. You heard Starmer today say what he did. He could have just said, no, this is a matter for the palace, which is what the line was at the weekend. He didn't. I can completely understand the King's reluctance to see any parliamentary process, because it's obviously very uncomfortable for them. I mean, Emily, you're right. In one sense, if Parliament then decides to start legislating to take,
where does it
formally
stop?
dukedoms away, that's an uncomfortable precedent for them, right? And it does conjure these memories, John, of the abdication crisis, which still is a sort of running, sort of sore and not a happy episode for the British royal family. But I do think it is interesting that you're starting to see this isn't going away, right? It's not going away, and MPs, because they are directly elected, are representing their constituents' unhappiness with this, and I think it'll be very interesting to see whether...
Don't you just think that Jenrick was kind of... I mean, I just heard that and I thought, oh my God, you're just jumping on a bandwagon here. You could have said this at any time in the last 5 years.
But the fact that he's made the calculation that if I jump on this bandwagon, I will get a huge amount of support.
Well, he jumps
from
on
the
a lot
press,
of bandwagons.
From the press and from others. I think there is...
And Davey doing it and others... And even Rachel Reeves yesterday again saying there should be more scrutiny. You can just feel it's an edifice which is cracking quite quickly.
I mean, the trouble is you've got the immovable, stupid object of Prince Andrew who thinks, I'm fine. Nothing to see here. I'm getting on with my life. I'm going on my shooting weekend. I mean, that's the problem.
But instead of banning Maccabee, how about banning the burka and halal meat?
Right. Well, I probably would ban the burqa.
Can we point out, before it becomes hysterical about the burqa, many European countries have banned that because the politicians will say that the way that women are treated, that's an opinion. Sarah Pochin asked that question and everybody went nuts in the Commons.
She did, but then you've also seen Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, say in the last week that this is something that she's going to pursue. So I think there's definitely a strong argument for it. Look, there are basic values in this country, and we should stand up and defend them. And where you're seeing them fraying at the edges or frankly being completely destroyed, whether it's Sharia courts or wearing of the burqa, these are issues we're going to have to confront if we want to build the kind of society that we want to hand on to our kids and grandkids.
That was Robert Jenrick again. Not that, as Emily said, he's ever one to jump on a bandwagon. He's talking to the wonderful Jeremy Kyle on Talk TV there. Always good for a nice, nuanced, measured discussion. They're talking about the burqa. And as you heard Robert Jenrick saying that he would ban the burqa. And this comes quite quickly after a series of quite interesting interventions from Conservative MPs, including one rising star, so-called, of the new intake, and the new intake isn't very big, but she's considered potentially a future leader of the party. This is Katie Lamb, who told the Sunday Times at the weekend that she believed that large numbers of people with legal status in the UK, i.e. indefinite leave to remain, would need to have their right to stay revoked and should go home. She said there are a large number of people in this country who came here legally, but in effect shouldn't have been able to do so. It's not the fault of the individuals who came here, but they will need to go home. What that will leave is a mostly, and this is the very interesting and perhaps chilling bit, is a mostly, but not entirely, culturally coherent group of people. And this follows what I would say has been a rapidly accelerating trend in Conservative politics, right-of-centre politics, I would say in particular over the last 6 to 12 months, which has started to move very rapidly away from the traditional right-wing critique of immigration, which is, look, this is basically about numbers, we don't have the capacity to absorb these people, we don't have enough schools, we don't have enough hospitals, we don't have enough roads, blah, houses, blah, 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 perfectly fair critique on sometimes, to a much more traditional and potentially much more problematic critique of immigration, which is basically what I would describe as a bit of blood and soil nationalism, old-fashioned, which is basically these people aren't like us, they can never be like us, and they're destroying our society by us allowing them to stay.
It is extraordinary to hear that phrase, culturally coherent. And I want to speak to Katie Lamb and just ask, can you just explain that for us? Just put it in simple black and white terms, and maybe it is black and white for her, or Muslim and Christian for her. I mean, what is the lack of cultural coherence that she sees? Who are the people that she's going to say are legally here but have to go? How would you determine who these people are? You just think of it in practical policy terms and just see the impossibility or near impossibility of it, unless you're going to have ICE squads just stopping brown people on the streets and saying, you're not part of our cultural coherence, it may be time you go home.
I think there's lots to sort of get into with this, and I think we've sort of, it orbits themes we've talked about quite a few times in the last sort of 6 to 12 months. I think that a lot of it represents the kind of rapid radicalisation of right-wing thought, which is mainly being driven by X, among other things. I think clearly part of it is about reform, and you are hearing, senior Conservative figures making statements that I think might make some, even Nigel Farage, blush on occasion, trying to sort of out-reform reform. Obviously, this sort of echoes, in a way, reform's promise on indefinite leave to remain. It's motivated a lot by this, basically, you'll hear a lot of people talking about the Boris wave. These are people who came during and in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic who, because they've been here for 5 years, will qualify for ILR status, indefinite leave to remain, and this is animating a lot of Conservative opinion at the moment. But let's just leave all of the kind of potential kind of like, a lot of people would say this is racism. They would say that, that it would be deeply chilling to many people, which is correct. What it also represents is a rapid retreat of Conservative politics away from being the party of law and order, of the rules-based system. Are we really saying this is Conservative parliamentarians here turning around and telling people who have come here under an existing legal order, not talking about changing it for future people, which you can have an argument about, and maybe that's a good idea, maybe it's bad, but you're basically turning around to people and their families and saying, sorry, you've been building a life here. You don't actually have the right to stay here. And why don't you have the right to stay here? Because you're insufficiently culturally coherent. Now, that's going to really... I'm already getting... I don't know about you, John. I'm already getting a lot of messages from people exactly in this sort of position who are really scared.
Yeah.
And I'm not surprised they're bloody scared, because it's then not even just about... When we're talking about cultural coherence, when we're injecting that, it's not even about the legal regime which existed and whether they're still making some qualification about, are they still in a job? Are they... what sort of job have they got? What's their income? Sort of criteria that you might be able to apply, which would still be a bit problematic in terms of basically changing the rules after the fact. But changing it on the basis of something as nebulous and, frankly, potentially chilling as whether or not you are culturally coherent, well, that is, I think, quite disturbing.
But but then I go back to my question. So if you're saying that the policy goal is cultural coherence, and we're going to revoke the right of people who are here legally to stay in this country, define cultural coherence or define cultural incoherence. Who are the people that you are saying have to go? Who are the people that are causing cultural incoherence? Can we have a definition, please, of that? Because, there are some people who live separate lives. Are you going to say that anyone who's, Muslim? What does it mean? And, the burka ban is sort of, I think, is clickbait politics to some extent. I think if you were to have a debate, as they have had in France, which is a very different one about the republic and about the separation of church and state, and that religion plays no part, and you say to kids going to school, you can't wear a burqa, you can't wear any religious symbols that say that you are, when you go to school, you're a child of the Fifth Republic. You are not going to school as a Muslim or a Jew or a Christian or a Catholic or whatever it happens to be, or a Sikh. So there are no religious symbols. Now, the French got into a right old mess about trying to do that, but I could see the logic of what they were trying to do in no religious symbols anywhere. But when you just single out the burqa or the hijab or whatever it happens to be, what are you saying? You can't wear a hoodie?
Or people in traditional Jewish dress, perhaps,
Yeah.
for example.
Yeah.
Would we say that that's culturally incoherent? And that's the problem. And unless you are going to go down that road, and you've got to be completely consistent.
Yes.
Or what you're doing is basically saying, we don't like the way some people live, and we're indifferent to or don't mind that of others. And I would just gently say, my understanding with Katie Lamb is that, and just to illustrate the point, I don't bring this up lightly in a sense, but my understanding of Katie Lamb is that her extended Dutch family came to Britain fleeing the Holocaust, and they were political refugees. Now, I'm very, very glad that they were accepted into the UK at the time. But imagine if a government after the war had turned around and gone, well, I'm afraid you're rather culturally incoherent, and we're going to have to send you back to the Netherlands or wherever you happen to come from. I mean, that would have been a monstrous thing to do, particularly given the circumstances. So I think, this is the problem. I mean, we can have an argument about future immigration. And I think it's perfectly legitimate to have an argument to say that do we, when we're thinking about when we're accepting people, are there arguments to say that that we do value people from certain countries and certain backgrounds more than others on the basis of potential integration? I think you can have that debate. I don't think that necessarily needs to be... I mean, people sometimes sort of cry racism about that. I don't think it's necessarily about racism. I think you can have an argument about kind of the potential for cultural integration and so on, and you marry that up with skills or whatever it happens to be. I think that's fine. And particularly liberalism ought not to be too dewy-eyed about that or too ultimately resistant to that. But to turn around and to say to people who have come here under an established legal set of principles that they may have to leave on the basis not of their employment status, not on the basis of their income status, on the basis of their criminal status or whatever it happens to be, but on the basis of their cultural status, I think, which presumably is going to be determined by the Home Office, I think that should give us all sleepless nights. Because the last thing that we would want to do, the last thing I want to see in this country is to see an equivalent, even though it's very fashionable to talk about it in right centre circles at the moment, some equivalent of ICE, when we're basically getting up, we're seeing week after week in the United States, ICE turning up in apartment blocks, rounding people up, and guess what? Absolutely inevitably, American citizens actually being, or children who are American citizens, their parents or the American citizens themselves being deported or at the very least detained for extended period. We don't want to create that sort of society in this country.
No, and the reason we're talking about this is not that Katie Lamb, this Conservative MP, is a nobody. The fact of the matter is she's very much a somebody. and being talked about as a future Conservative Party leader. And so you just have to kind of look at Conservative Party politics in that light.
And Badenoch has not criticised her for it, has refused to, as far as I know, at the time of recording, say anything about it. And actually, intriguingly as well, I mean, this is, and it goes back to kind of like Keir Starmer's maybe lack of direction sometimes. When Number 10 were asked about this yesterday, they gave a rather kind of mealy-mouthed, they refused to kind of like outright condemn or whatever. Now, my point about that is that, fine, do that, but only a few weeks ago, we were in Liverpool, and the Prime Minister gave a full-throated kind of defence of, or attack on, exactly that sort of politics that Nigel Farage had been articulating earlier in the week and called his policy, very similar sort of policy, racist. So have some consistency. It's either one or the other, and I think it reveals the muddle in Number 10 itself about how to deal with these things.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.